Ivan Pavlov was the guy who discovered the basic principles of classical conditioning. Pavlov never ever thought of himself as a psychologist. He was trained as a physiologist, had a degree in medicine. To his dying day, he thought psychology was this fluffy thing that he didn't want to be associated with. So he'd be horrified to realize that the reason people talk to him all these years after his death is because of his contributions to psychology. Anyway, he was born in Russia. His father was the village priest. His mother was the daughter of a priest, and it was assumed that he would be a priest someday too. Their lifestyle was typical of a small town peasant family at that time. They would work in the fields all day, but about age 10, he had a very serious accident which resulted in a long period of very poor health. Since his family had to work in the fields, he was taken care of by his godfather, who was the abbot of a nearby monastery. So he lived in this monastery, and the monks took care of him, but they also educated him. They recognized how smart he was, and so he was given kind of a rigorous program of reading and study and discussion with educated adults. And at that time, the Tsar of Russia had a program to identify gifted students who were poor, and so he used this to complete his medical degree. But jobs were scarce. He drifted from one lousy job to another, and it wasn't until he was in his 40s that he landed his first real permanent job at St. Petersburg Military Medical Academy. His first research interests were in the workings of the digestive system, and his work was so valuable that he won the Nobel Prize for it in 1904. So a trivia question that can trip psychologists up is to ask them, what did Pavlov win his Nobel Prize for? And people assume it's classical conditioning, but no, it was for his early work on digestion. He actually used to put little windows in the stomachs of dogs and watch as their food got digested as a way of understanding how digestion worked. He didn't begin his work on conditioned reflexes until he was well into his 50s. Pavlov was kind of an interesting character. He was so focused on his work that his wife had to protect him from the mundane affairs of everyday life. She had to remind him to collect his salary. He couldn't even buy his own clothes. In his early years of marriage, they were so poor that he slept on a cot in his lab while his family lived with relatives. They were so poor that one of his children died because they couldn't afford medical care for him. And he was the classic absent-minded professor. When he finally traveled to New York for a conference one time, he hadn't gotten off the boat for more than an hour. Then all of his money was stolen and his pockets were picked, and the poor guy was really taken advantage of. Having said all that, he was a brilliant scientist, and his contributions to psychology are extremely long-lasting. Pavlov is an extremely important figure in the history of psychology, and I certainly want you to know who he is and why he's important. However, I promise that I will not ask you any questions on quizzes about his personal life. All of the information I gave you about him on the previous slide was just because I like to tell you the story of the people behind the science, that they were real human beings with real lives. But on the quizzes, I'm only going to ask you questions. If I ask you about him at all, it'll just be to know who he is. But I will want you to know the ins and outs of classical conditioning, which is why we're studying Pavlov in this course. Pavlov first discovered classical conditioning in a very interesting way. He noticed that there was a particular one of his lab assistants who, whenever this person walked into the lab, the dogs would start salivating. They didn't salivate when anybody else walked into the lab, and Pavlov was curious about why this was happening. Well, it turns out that this was the person who was responsible for feeding the dogs. So the dogs had come to associate that individual with getting fed. Now, there are some things out there in the world that are really important, and we need to be able to predict them because they have important consequences for us. So food for the dog would be an example of one of these things. And these things are known as unconditioned stimuli because when you first are exposed to them, you don't have to learn how to respond to it. You do it automatically. The dog salivates when you present it with food, and it does it without the benefit of any learning whatsoever. If I were to apply an electric shock to your right arm, you would probably scream and flinch, and do all kinds of involuntary things, and you don't have to learn how to do that. So the electric shock and the food would be examples of what we call unconditioned stimuli. They're stimuli in the world that automatically elicit or pull out of us a certain response. Now, other things out there are pretty neutral. So the sound of a bell, for example, with the dog, at first, the bell doesn't really mean anything to the dog. The dog hears it and might look at it, but it doesn't have any strong emotional reaction to it. But if you ring the bell every single time you give the dog food, after a while, the dog will salivate when it hears the bell, even if the food isn't there. In this case, the bell has come to be what we call a conditioned stimulus, and it produces a conditioned response. The dog now salivates because it has learned to associate the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. If I rang a bell every time I applied an electric shock to your arm, pretty soon I would notice you flinching and your heart rate going up whenever you heard the bell, even if I didn't give you the shock. So the conditioned stimulus acquires the properties of the unconditioned stimulus because of the fact that they've been paired in time. Now, there are two very good videos that explain how classical conditioning works and how it's different from operant conditioning. And I want you to certainly watch at least one of those videos, preferably both. I think you'll find them entertaining. So I'm not going to get into as much detail about how classical conditioning works as I would if we were in a traditional classroom and I was lecturing on it. But I do want you to be aware that you can do classical conditioning in a variety of different ways, and your textbook describes what these are. You can present the conditioned stimulus first and either start the unconditioned stimulus before the conditioned stimulus has disappeared. This is called delay conditioning. Or you can have the conditioned stimulus come on and go off before the unconditioned stimulus appears. This is called trace conditioning. You can present them both at the same time, which is simultaneous conditioning. And there's even something called backward conditioning, where you present the unconditioned stimulus first, followed by the conditioned stimulus. Each of these procedures produces a very different looking pattern of behavior and a different strength of conditioning. And you can shape different kinds of responses by using the procedure in slightly different ways. But I'll let you study about that in the textbook. There are a variety of other details about classical conditioning that you'll be studying about. You'll find that the intensity of the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus affect how easily conditioning occurs, how long they're presented for have an effect. And all classic conditioned stimuli, are not equally conditionable. We're biologically predisposed to learn some things more quickly than others. Let me give you an example from something known as vicarious classical conditioning. Vicarious classical conditioning is a procedure where we get conditioned to something through the responses of another person. Vicarious classical conditioning is classical conditioning. It's not a different technique, but it's a form of classical conditioning where the unconditioned stimulus is the emotional response of another person. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose a little boy who's about 2 goes out for a walk with his mother, and they're walking down the street, and all of a sudden a snake slithers out of the bushes in front of them. Well, the little boy's never seen a snake before. For him, the snake is a totally neutral stimulus, doesn't have any strong effect. But the mother absolutely freaks out. She starts screaming, she grabs the little boy, and she runs away. The mother's fear, the mother's strong emotional response has a very powerful effect on the child. The little boy is upset because his mother's upset. So for the little boy, the mother's emotional response is an unconditioned stimulus. Well, let's suppose they go out for a walk a few days later. Same thing happens. Snake comes out, the mother freaks out, the little boy gets scared. What's happening here is the neutral stimulus, the snake, is a conditioned stimulus. The mother's powerful emotional response is an unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, when the little boy sees a snake, If the mother's not there, the little boy will respond in a very strong negative way because he's been conditioned through vicarious classical conditioning to fear the snake. And I use the snake as an example because we quickly learn some associations and not so quickly others. There are certain things out there in the world that through evolution we had to be very careful about. When you think about the things that people are afraid of, the things that people have phobias about, they tend to be pretty consistent. Snakes, spiders, heights, deep water, enclosed spaces, things that would have been very dangerous for humans in their early environment. You didn't have the luxury of trial and error learning. You had to very quickly make the association between a stimulus and whether or not it was dangerous. And so we very quickly learn phobias about things like snakes, even though most people who have snake phobias have never really had an unpleasant situation or interaction with a snake themselves. If I were to walk into my classroom with a bucket of snakes and start passing them all around and tossing them in the air, there'd be chaos. People would be screaming and running. So the point I'd like to make here is that classical conditioning is not just some laboratory curiosity that applies to dogs and bells. It underlies a lot of what goes on in everyday human life. Maybe you've had the experience of having some food that you had eaten just about the time you were getting really sick. The food really had nothing to do with your being sick, but you found that for a long time after that you couldn't eat it again because it had been associated with being nauseous. That's a conditioned food aversion. It's an example of classical conditioning. Why you like some people better than others can sometimes be traced to the fact that some people are regularly paired with pleasant experiences, others are paired with unpleasant experiences, and so we develop positive or negative feelings about them. Racial prejudices, sexual fetishes, all of these things are thought to depend, at least to some extent, on classical conditioning. So it's a very important part of human life. Here's a diagram showing you that little kids learn to associate the smell of alcohol or the alcohol bottle with getting an injection or a shot or a vaccination. And that's an unpleasant thing. So the alcohol becomes the conditioned stimulus, the needle is the unconditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response ends up looking a lot like the unconditioned response. We already talked a little bit about phobias. For those of you who want to see your worst nightmare, if you have a snake phobia, click on the picture of the woman in the upper right-hand corner. But I will issue a trigger warning here. If you do have a genuine snake phobia, you may not want to click on that picture. In the chapter, there are a variety of different terms and vocabulary that I'll want you to be familiar with. I won't just go down the list and give all the definitions here because they're very clearly defined in the book, but things like conditioned inhibition, second order conditioning, inhibition of delay, blocking, discrimination and generalization, very important ones, extinction, spontaneous recovery. So, read the section of the chapter on classical conditioning. Make sure you look at least one of the videos on the webpage for the module. And when the exam comes, when the quiz comes, I'm certain to give you hypothetical situations in which you're asked to identify what the conditioned stimulus is, what the unconditioned stimulus is, what the conditioned response is. So you'll want to understand how the process works, not just memorize a bunch of terms.